It's not exactly a secret at this point, but China is on the brink of collapse. Now, I know you've heard me say that before, but every time I've made that claim, I've also made sure to point out the fact that this is a long process, that it will not happen overnight, that it has been 2 decades in the making, and it probably won't end for another few years either. The reality is there though. The Chinese economy is teetering on a knife edge. It's going to see a total demographic collapse as the result of idiotic communist policy, and its foreign diplomacy is forcing its best customers, the countries which import the most goods from China, to decouple their trade networks as it becomes clear once and for all just how hostile and dangerous the Communist Party really is. The truth is that this collapse started over a year ago. It was ignored by the mainstream media for months because it wasn't important enough to them. It saw a spike of attention as Evergrande defaulted on its debts before disappearing into obscurity again, and finally it's come rearing its ugly head once more. The country is suffering from a government-led crackdown on some of the most successful companies in the world, a COVID crisis that it can't contend with, and the largest property bubble in the history of the earth. Now you might say, why did the collapse stop only to start up again? But the reality is that China's collapse never actually ended. It never slowed down, you just convinced yourself it had. Now, one of the biggest problems with China's economy and business environment right now, and the one which is mostly just ignored by investors eager to try and find the next Alibaba, is the nature of the Communist Party and their tendency to destroy businesses in order to increase their authority. This is, of course, a tale as old as time, but for China, it really took a change of pace towards the end of the 2010s. It started with the biggest fish first, Jack Ma's Ant Group, Alibaba and Tencent, all some of the biggest, most successful and influential companies in the world, all Chinese, and all on a path to continue to grow seemingly forever, but each of them was attacked needlessly by the Communist Party in a pure attempt to curb their influences. The CCP was watching them grow, and they were terrified by the wealth their owners had created, the data they had access to, and their ability to sway the opinion of the public. They were just deemed too powerful. One of the first signs of this regulatory crackdown came after a seemingly innocent comment made by Jack Ma at an event mentioning offhand how the Chinese financial system could use some improvement. Now let's be perfectly honest here, what financial system couldn't use some improvement? This is the extent to which the CCP is power hungry, that merely stating something which every person in the world knows to be true is enough to draw the communists' wrath. What followed this innocent comment was the disappearance of one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world, and what basically amounted to the seizure of his companies by one of the most authoritarian countries in the world. The CCP had apparently awoken to the risk that billionaires posed to its world order, and it started to strike. Ant Group's IPO was cancelled the weekend before it was due to break the world record for the largest public offering in history, and it would never get close to that point again. Alibaba saw its highest level staff members kicked from their jobs and replaced with Communist Party officials who were determined to ensure their rule continued. Jack Ma disappeared for 3 months. Many people thought he was dead, but in the end, he was merely defanged. Tencent was fined billions of dollars for the gross crime of making too much money. Didi, a ride-hailing app which basically just amounted to China's IP theft of Uber, saw its IPO overshadowed by a merciless attack from the CCP which forced its share price to collapse by 90%, again, for the simple act of choosing to list in a foreign market and not in China. The entire education industry in China was essentially nationalized overnight as profit was outlawed and foreigners were banned from being teachers. Why was this done? Purely so that the Communist Party can ensure that children are being taught what they want them to be taught and not awkward Western ideals like freedom of speech and freedom of thought. Gaotu, a company that was literally providing a public service to people and creating wealth at the same time, saw its share price collapse overnight by a ridiculous 99% because it simply became illegal for the company to make any money. But the CCP doesn't just limit itself to destroying companies, it also insists on destroying lives. Zhao Jinghua was a Chinese fund manager who personally invested money for many Communist Party officials, and he made them very rich. That was until he was found in a hotel room by Chinese government officials in 2017, beaten to death, and then taken out of the hotel in a wheelchair covered in a sheet in an attempt to hide his murder. We still, to this day, 5 years later, do not know why the CCP suddenly decided that he had to go, but this is indicative of the Communist Party's willingness to destroy business, wealth and capital as long as it results in more control for the party. More recently, we've seen China start a new wave of crackdowns, this time targeting the entire financial industry. At this point in time, there are over 100 businessmen and officials who currently or used to work in finance in China who have either been arrested on trumped-up charges or are under investigation. Chan Huyu, who built China Merchants Bank up into the largest retail bank in China, has been placed under investigation, supposedly for a discipline inspection, which has sent the share price of that company crashing down 20% over the course of 1 month and nearly 40% from its all-time highs. The real problem is that there are just so many damn examples of crackdowns by the CCP that destroy wealth and disrupt the flow of capitalism in China that it is literally not possible for me to cover them all here, but the story always follows the same lines. A company does well, it grows and expands and hires people, it creates wealth and distributes it out amongst its owners, employees and the rest of the country through taxes, but as it grows rich, it also grows powerful. The CCP sees the potential risk that a wealthy billionaire or a successful company might have, and they strike and destroy its prospects, and along with that, they destroy all the wealth that came along. Now really quickly, a quick word from this video's sponsor, Masterworks.io. Now stagflation is a very scary word, and what it means is even worse. For those that don't know, stagflation is an economic scenario where inflation is high and economic growth slows. With inflation soaring to 8, 9 or even 10%, a global crisis and top firms predicting stock market returns under 5% for the next 15 years, the threat of stagflation is very real. What does this mean for you and me? Well, restructuring portfolios has never been more difficult or more crucial, so where can you turn? Well, you will know that I've been advocating for alternatives for years and they've done pretty well for me. And it seems like other people are finally catching on. A recent JP Morgan report declared that alternative assets are no longer optional. In light of this new normal, certain platforms have arisen, giving access to the top alternative asset classes. There's one in particular that seems like a no-brainer to me, and it's called Masterworks. Now, Masterworks have solidified themselves as the platform for investing in contemporary art. They let you access their exclusive investments from names like Banksy, Monet, and other iconic artists just for a fraction of what billionaires pay to purchase. Roughly 2/3 of billionaires allocate between 10 and 30% of their overall portfolios to art, in part to diversify and because it's a natural inflation hedge. It makes sense, after all. Contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500's total return by 164% from 1995 to 2021, and they've exhibited the lowest correlation to equities of nearly any major asset class. Since 2020, Masterworks has sold 3 paintings, with each returning over 30% net to their investors, and their offerings usually sell out within hours. Here's how they do it. The Masterworks research team analyzes over 60,000 data points to find financially attractive works that they believe will appreciate in value. Then Masterworks acquires paintings ranging from $1 to $30 million, and they securitize them by filing a public offering with the SEC. It's that easy. If you want to get in on it early, all you have to do is go to masterworks.io, create an account, check out what they have and invest in their offerings, and my subscribers get to skip their waitlist at the special link in my bio. Now, China's problems are not just limited to business or capitalism. No, the country is also plagued by the COVID pandemic, even 2 years after attempts to get things in order. As the rest of the world gets on with their lives and begins the slow march back to normality, China is moving in the opposite direction, resorting to locking down some of the largest cities in the world because it utterly failed when it came to developing a vaccine. As the West saw nearly 100 different attempts to build a vaccine for the COVID virus from numerous different countries and companies, China put all of its hopes on one vaccine known as Sinovac. The only problem is that this vaccine just does not work anymore. Now, to be clear, it just about worked back in 2021, before the virus had mutated enough times to get around the antibodies created, but at this point in time, after we've seen the Alpha, Delta, Omicron and more variants, the Sinovac vaccine has proven itself utterly incapable of actually protecting people, and such is the Communist Party's hubris that it has outright refused to provide its citizens with anything not made and designed in China. Over the past few months, this problem has been brewing. It started off with higher cases and increased deaths across the country, and slowly, bit by bit, it started to overwhelm the entirety of China. The city of Shenzhen, which houses over 14 million people, far more than New York, London or Paris, was put under the strictest lockdown you can imagine, with everyone forced into homes at gunpoint and those who were ill forced into what basically amounts to concentration camps, often left to starve with barely enough food to survive. Then came Shanghai, a city of almost 30 million people, quite literally one of the biggest cities in the world, and it was shut down too. Now we are on the verge of seeing the exact same thing happen to Beijing, the capital of China, with a population of over 20 million people. All of this amounts to lost productivity. Shops that aren't selling goods, factories that aren't producing them, people who aren't making cash, and businesses that are hemorrhaging it. Exports that aren't being loaded onto ships, and coal that isn't being mined. The effect of lockdowns is widely known. We've seen it all before and very recently too. The simple fact is that it is devastating for the economy, and there is no magic off button that the Communist Party can press. There is no way to make up for this lost productivity, and there is no way for the Chinese to end this process with any kind of urgency. It usually takes years to develop a vaccine, but under expedited circumstances, it can be done in around about 1 year. The problem is, when you speed the process up, you increase the likelihood of failure and side effects, and China is working all alone here. We just do not know how long it will be until China is able to create a vaccine that actually works and then vaccinate its absolutely massive population of well over 1 billion people. The chances are we're talking about months, not weeks here, maybe even years. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that the final and really the largest problem facing the Chinese economy right now is one entirely of their own making. It is, of course, the housing market, the largest asset bubble in the world, and the fact that it is literally crumbling apart as we speak. Now, while investing in real estate isn't unique to China, the way it works over there absolutely is. In the West, in a country like the UK, investors buy a home, a house or a flat in a location that people want to live in. They then rent that property out at market rates to people who want to live in it. Despite the vitriol directed at landlords online these days, there is nothing wrong with this, and it is actually a very efficient system. It allows for investment into the property industry, which increases the supply of housing and enables flexibility for people who require it, as many people have no desire to buy a home and tie themselves down to a single location. In China though, people who buy apartments usually don't live in them themselves, and they usually don't rent them out either. They just leave them there to sit empty. The reason why people don't rent out their apartments is actually quite simple. They can't rent them out because no one wants to live in them. These apartments are part of what makes up Chinese ghost cities, entire cities in the country which hardly anyone lives in. They have roads and railway stations, apartment blocks and schools, but no people. They have swimming pools that were never filled, pavements that were never paved, and shops that were never occupied. These cities are built by property developers and the local government, but they were never meant to be lived in. They were merely meant to be sold for a profit to an investor who will just let it sit there until they retire in 30 years, at which point they'll sell that apartment on to the next fool in line. Of course, that sounds ridiculous to us, but the Chinese saw this as more as a bump in the road rather than a fundamental flaw. From their point of view, all cities have to start somewhere, and with enough time, these ghost cities would eventually become real ones, and their investments would become real as well. The problem with this is that artificial cities don't always work, and the only time they really do is if there is a huge lack of housing already, or if a government artificially creates enough jobs in that city to drive immigration, as has been seen with successful planned cities all over the world. In China, that isn't the case though. There are an estimated 65 million homes, or 20% of the total supply of the entire country, sitting empty. That means that there are enough apartments empty in China to house the entire population of France. The other problem with this, though, is that you actually can't house people in these apartments because, again, they were never designed to have people living them. Now, you might say, oh, that just means they need some love, a lick of paint, and some furniture to fill them out. But no, you literally can't live in them. They don't have electricity or running water, they don't have windows or doors, they don't have elevators or fire escapes. Oftentimes, they don't even have staircases. They are concrete shells designed to look complete from the outside, designed to draw in money from unsuspecting Chinese investors who will only ever look at renderings and pictures, but there is nothing on the inside to differentiate them from literal construction sites. They are unsafe to visit, let alone live in, and it's not unheard of for entire skyscrapers to be forcibly demolished because they are so unstable that they could collapse at any point. The Chinese real estate market is a textbook definition of a bubble, one that for decades wasn't just encouraged, but actually driven specifically by the Communist Party. But in 2021, everything changed as the CCP implemented the Three Red Lines policy, which basically signed a death warrant for this entire industry. Now, the actual details of the policy aren't too important, but what it did in general was put limits on the amount of debt that a company could take out in regards to its assets, profits, and revenues. If a company exceeded those limits, they wouldn't be able to take out any more debt. Now, despite the fact that these rules really weren't particularly stringent at all, pretty much every property developer in China failed to meet the requirements and so could no longer take out new debts. All the problems that we're seeing today actually started when the policy was enacted almost a year ago. It's just taken a long time for them to develop. Now you might say, so what if a developer can't take out more debts? It just means that they can't grow at crazy rates. Surely they would still be able to complete the projects they have already started and pay off their old debts with those new profits, right? Well, that's where the problems started to mount, because these companies couldn't do that. You see, their debt was mounting up and the interest payments that they were due to pay were getting larger as well. Usually they'd simply take out more debt, issue more bonds to pay off that old debt, but the Three Red Lines policy had put an end to that. They had to sell their assets to pay off their debts. Now, if there had only been one company in this position, then this probably wouldn't have been a problem. But there was no one else to sell these properties to because every developer found itself in the same situation. They were all in the same boat. They were all strapped for cash. These companies' bond prices started to collapse along with their share prices as the underlying assets that held everything together were suddenly exposed as little more than a Ponzi scheme. The only option that these companies have is to sell the assets that the companies have, their apartments or their developments, but we already know that the other developers can't afford to buy new projects, so that only leaves the average Chinese citizen to buy them up. Again though, there's a problem with that, because the only reason to buy any of these properties is the idea that they'll be worth more in the future, but when prices start to fall, the number of willing buyers drops off a cliff. If I, a property investor, see every other property investor go bankrupt, I still know that I can sell my property to people who actually want to live in it, but in China, as we've already explained, no one can live in these apartments. The second these properties look like they're not going to keep going up in value, or even worse, go down in value, then demand for them will instantly collapse. When every buyer is an investor just hoping to flip the apartment on to a greater fall, it is so much easier for a small down market to turn into a full-on market rout. There is a black hole of debt in China worth multiple trillions of dollars that simply will never be repaid. Now at this point in time, this process, this collapse of the Chinese property market is already in full swing. Now the Communist Party is of course trying to hide this information, publishing figures that are not supported by any independent verifiers and just simply not publishing figures about these ghost cities themselves. But money talks, and some impartial sites have been able to actually track home prices, and it doesn't look good. According to this source, right now home prices in China have fallen by almost 10% compared to just 1 year ago. According to Bloomberg, home prices have been falling every month since about mid-2021. Fitch Ratings is expecting the number of sales in the Chinese property market to fall by 10 to 15% each year, and for prices themselves to fall by 5%. No matter how much propaganda is put out by state-owned media sites like the Global Times, the markets will see through the smoke because they're based on economic realities. The simple fact is that the Chinese economy is based on growth for growth's sake. The Communist Party has built bridges to nowhere, buildings that can't house people, and cities that only exist on maps. The crackdowns the CCP insist on carrying out are never going to stop because it is simply in the CCP's nature to increase its authority. The scorpion will always kill the frog, no matter what the consequences may be, because it's all they know how to do. The COVID crisis hitting China right now can only be solved in the short term by the CCP reaching out and asking for help from the West, by simply asking for vaccines that work, but the hubris of the communists means that will never happen either. China's already spent 2 years creating one failing vaccine. How long until they can finally get it right, design and manufacture one that protects its citizens? The reality is that China is looking at a minimum of another year of this chaos. Finally, the housing market bubble that can only end once it is not a bubble but a pile of rubble. Years of reckless government projects and a society that convinced itself the good times would never end will always result in a crash where the lows are just as low as the highs were high. Again, the only way out is on the ground floor, right where China started. Now, these problems have been emerging for months now, even years, and yet so many started to believe that the CCP had done the impossible, that it had fixed everything and in record time too. Every day it becomes more and more clear that it's time to pay the piper. The communists just hid their problems and our journalists got bored of reporting on it. The reality is that China's collapse never ended, it never slowed down, you just convinced yourself it had. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like, comment and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that can help you protect your portfolio against inflation through fractional shares of art from world famous artists like Banksy. Art has historically proven to be uncorrelated to the markets, so it's a really valuable resource with the markets on the brink. It's completely free to sign up, so make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BlockFi, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get over 7% interest on stablecoins to protect your hard-earned cash from being eaten away by inflation. Thanks for watching, stay stoic. Until next time.